The objectives for today today is more of an introductory course about advocacy and what is advocacy, the different types of advocacy, and also to understand how advocacy is different and similar and overlaps to other concepts like organizing and activism. Um, and we are also going to be introduced to the steps in an advocacy planning process, but we'll go into those in more detail in the future sessions. So as I mentioned, this is one of 4 sessions, and there is an advocacy guideline that goes along with all of the material that's being shared today. I'm going to post in the chat a link to that, which you should all be able to access now. Um, so the content that I share and discuss in these presentations is referenced back in those guidelines. I will be updating those guidelines throughout these sessions as well. As I go develop the presentations, I will probably be making changes in the guidelines and updating it, and also based on feedback and discussions that we have. Because all of you have experience in advocacy, whether you know it or not. And so I am not the only expert in this room, and my expertise comes from my own experience. And you all have your own experiences that bring your own expertise as well. So I'm going to be trying to incorporate your learnings, your ideas back into the guide as we go along. So it will be updated as we go. But I shared the link so you can reference that. I will also be sharing the link to these slides towards the end of the presentation, so you can reference them as well. And again, today is more introductory, and also it's a chance for me to better understand you all and what you're doing and what your interests are, and then I can customize the later sessions to better respond to your needs and interests and experiences. So let's get started. Um, what is advocacy? At its basis, advocacy is any activity that strives to influence the decisions of others to change conditions of a specific situation. Engaging in advocacy involves publicly supporting the interest of an individual, a group, or a cause. So advocacy is a pretty broad term, and there's a lot of things that can fall under this. Here is an example, and I'll be sharing some examples from my experiences throughout this presentation. This is an example of a group of children, including my own. This is my daughter here, Amelia, advocating to U.S. Congress against cuts to government budget for public schools as part of the Free DC campaign. So this was earlier this year. Like I mentioned, I live in Washington, D.C., and without getting into the politics, and it's very complex, but our funding is greatly affected by national issues. And so there was a big threat, there still is, to the funding for our schools. And so we took our children to advocate to Congress about why we did not want them to cut funding for our schools. So the children made these signs. You see this one, "Don't fire our teachers. We have good teachers." And so this is an example, very basic example of the advocacy that I've been a part of. So there are 3 types of advocacy: self-advocacy, individual advocacy, systems advocacy. Now, let's talk about each one of these. So self-advocacy is like advocating for yourself. So it's the act of advocating for your own rights, your needs, or your interests. And we all have to be self-advocates in some way or another, in terms of, especially if you are part of a group that or in a system, or really, and this happens to everybody at some point, where you're being discriminated against or ignored or mistreated. So advocating for yourself is the act of advocating for your own rights. And it involves first knowing that you have rights and what those rights are. And it also involves skills and confidence to being able to do that advocacy. Individual advocacy is advocacy for someone else. So when a person or a group is advocating for the rights, needs of one or a few individuals. So you're still talking about, so sort of someone who is not able to advocate for their own, on their own or needs someone to help them advocate for their rights. You may do individual advocacy by helping to advocate for them on an individual basis. Now, systems advocacy is advocacy for large scale change that affects entire groups or communities. Um, Systems advocacy is often, but not always, directed at laws or policies in government or institutions. And it's not always government either. It could be institutions like businesses, large corporations, or small businesses as well. Um, and it can also include but it's not always about changing laws or policies. Sometimes it's about advocacy for changes in social societal norms or practices that are happening, whether or not there's a policy or law in place. Now, systems advocacy, again, is more large scale, but that still could happen at the local level, the national level, the international level. Now, our guidelines are mostly focused on the systems advocacy, which is what many of the issues that you all raise. So issues like education, equal access to education, climate change. These are systems level issues. You can address them locally. You can address them internationally and nationally, but they're still systems level issues. And so that's where we're mostly going to focus on. But let's look at a couple examples. So self-advocacy. An example might be a student in school who cannot understand a teacher's instructions because they have a learning disability, and they advocate for themselves by asking for help and extra support. I mentioned that one of the areas that I do advocacy in is around disabilities, students with disabilities. And one of the things we had to work with my daughter on, for example, was helping her to understand when she needed to advocate for herself, when she needed to speak up and say, I don't understand this because of this learning disability. I need these extra supports. And so that's an example of self-advocacy. Um, Individual advocacy, an example is a lawyer who advocates for the rights of domestic abuse survivor to get custody for her children. So a lawyer who is advocating for an individual woman who is being abused and helping her get the rights in court or by law to get custody of her children away from her abuser. So that's an example of individual advocacy. Systems advocacy is when like a group of people or an individual are advocating for the government to adopt legislation that raises the age of marriage in the country and to eradicate child marriage. So that's looking at something that would happen large scale, affecting many, many people across in that country. What are some examples of these types from your own work? Would anyone like to share an example from the advocacy that you do, that is self-advocacy or individual advocacy or systems advocacy? Aisha, go ahead.
Well, I haven't actually done a lot of advocating, but or any experience at all. But like for system advocacy, whenever I say that I want to make sure that the biodiversity stays like diverse, I think that would go into system advocacy because I'm helping like a group of animals or an entire population. And for individual advocacy, I'm usually the class monitor in school, and so whenever like a student gets in trouble, and then there's like some committee or whatever that's like making sure that's like, well, that's for behavior and things like that, then I always have to go and try to advocate for the student that no, this was just a mistake.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example. Yeah, that's a great example of individual advocacy. Um, and often there's yeah, like advocating for students. Yeah, that's a great example. The Ilham put in the chat systems advocacy about um, girls being able to study. So girls being able to go to school. broadly speaking, is an example of systems advocacy. Sarah, before I get to you, Aisha, I think you raise a really interesting point about ecological and climate change because a lot of the information about advocacy or a lot of the publications focus on people and advocating for people. And so it is very interesting and important to think about it from a broader ecological standpoint, where we're talking about advocating for the environment, for entire ecosystems. And also how, for example, individual advocacy works when we're not talking about people, but we're talking about animals or we're talking about the environment. And so I think that's a really interesting and important nuance to all of this discussion. Um, and also with self-advocacy, right? So an animal can't advocate for themselves. An ecosystem, the oceans can't advocate for themselves, right? So that's when it becomes it kind of blurs some of these lines as well. Sarah, go ahead.
Yeah, mine is a lot like your example of that girls aren't allowed to study. So when Taliban banned school for Afghan girls, me and my classmates, not only us, but all students from the whole school, we all raised our voices, just kind of like protested against Taliban's ruling. But it didn't work, though. It was kind of like advocacy.
Yes, that's definitely advocacy, and that's definitely one of the challenges with advocacy. That we will have a session where we talk about advocacy survival skills because one of the biggest challenges with advocacy is this we fail a lot or that it takes a long time. And that's something I know for me that I struggle with a lot right now, like especially when it comes to Palestine. And a lot of issues really. And so thank you for sharing that example. But that is an example of yes, of systems advocacy. But it can also be self-advocacy if you're because you're advocating for yourself too, right? So it's these lines are not always clear and they often sometimes happen together and they need to happen together. And so I think that's a great example of how the overlap in some of these different categories. And yeah. Um, And then Fauzia says, I have participated in systems advocacy by raising awareness and promoting policies against early and forced marriage. Yes, that's systems advocacy. And Layeka, sorry if I'm mispronouncing. Self-advocacy is, for example, when a patient tells a doctor, I felt dizzy with this medicine. Patient advocacy is a great example of self-advocacy because a lot of times certain groups women, for example, their doctors don't listen to them or don't trust them because medicine isn't often designed or historically has been tested on men. And so sometimes when women try and share a symptom, doctors will ignore us. And so there's a big self-advocacy piece happens in medicine. And I don't, here in the US, they also have roles called patient advocates at hospitals where someone is hired to do individual advocacy to help patients advocate for themselves. Okay, let's move on because now we're going to talk about, oh wait, hold on first, sorry. An important thing to know is that advocacy in and of itself is not inherently good. Many people use self-advocacy, individual advocacy, and systems advocacy in ways that can harm others. Um, so and I have the question here, can you think of some examples? But I add this to say that none of these techniques are not inherently good. Your adversaries, people that disagree with you, or people that are trying to oppress us or you, are also often using these techniques as well. And so that's important to keep in mind, is that advocacy in and of itself is not inherently good. It's what you're using that advocacy for. It's what that issue is and how you are analyzing and thinking through how that issue will affect others is what makes sure you're doing it or that it is being done for good. But plenty of people use advocacy for not good. Sarah, go ahead.
I think it usually happens in courts, when there is a criminal and its defense, his or her defense lawyer wants to, advocate the person, and probably they might say things that are not actually good, it's not used for good purposes.
Yeah, that's a good example of individual advocacy being used for bad or not good, or for to cause harm. Yeah, that's a great example. Mokadisa.
Hey everyone, hope everyone will be fine and doing well. Yeah, about this question, I can answer that advocacy against women's rights is also one of the example. Some conservative groups have strongly opposed women working or going to school. There is a culture or religious justification, but that does directly harm half of the population of Afghanistan, and also it is not a religious problem. It is a really harmful thing in our community.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the harmful, unequal, oppressive policies that you have in your country, that I have in my country, are because of conservative groups or certain groups advocating for them, to do, and they cause harm. Yeah, and that's systems advocacy for harm. Abdul, go ahead.
Okay, so for the system advocacy, for example, like a group of lobbies for a law that benefits only rich and minority, but harms the environment and the poor people. It's like a system advocacy.
Yeah, so if you think about all the corporations, the oil companies, that are advocating for tax cuts, even as they are perpetuating, putting more carbon dioxide into the environment. These corporations, they are doing advocacy, and they are doing advocacy for harm. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a great example. And so this is what us as advocates for good are up against, and it's challenging. But that is why we have to be strategic and come up with plans and find out where our power lies so that we can take on these large groups that are also doing advocacy, that's causing harm. Yeah, I think that's a great example. And Sharana put some examples in the chat of examples. These are all examples for good, I think. So of self-advocacy, Sharana said a student with a disability speaking to their teacher to ask for extra time on exam. Yes, that's an example of self-advocacy for good. Students with disability often need extra time. A social worker helps a woman getting legal support to fight a case of domestic violence is individual advocacy, and systems advocacy and organization, fighting to change a national law that bans girls from going to school. And then Fauzia gives an example of advocacy for harm, when people advocate against women's rights and stopping girls from going to school. Yeah, this is an example of advocacy for harm. Okay, let's move on. So there are a lot of terms out there, that I also want to talk about how they are similar to advocacy and, different in how they overlap. In particular, terms like advocacy and activism are often used interchangeably, and there are a lot of similarities. There's also an important term called organizing that goes hand in hand with these. And then there's the concept of service provision. So when we're looking for large scale change, you will hear these various terms similar to advocacy, like activism and organizing. Um, and Sorry, that's an incomplete sentence. And although these terms are often defined differently, there are overlaps, and they often happen simultaneously and in concert with each other. So, and they can be complementary strategies for change. So, as part of this effort to thinking through what is advocacy, I also want to talk about these other categories that have similarities and overlaps. So again, advocacy. So as we talked about, it's an activity that strives to influence decisions of others in order to change conditions for oneself, for an individual, or at a systemic level. So when we're thinking about how advocacy compares to, say, activism, advocacy often works within systems, working within the systems that we have. So, for example, giving testimony at organized hearings by government agencies. So, here's an example of me. This was several years ago. When I gave a testimony at an open hearing. So in our local government, in the Washington, D.C. local government, not the national government, we have a council and they set our budget and they have open hearings where anyone can go and say what they think about the budget and what they think should be in the budget. And often we're having to advocate for more funding for issues like education. And so this is an example of me. I signed up for the testimony. I wrote my testimony. I shared it with other people who are also advocating for this. And then I showed up and I gave my testimony. And so, yeah, so this is an example of working within the system. So the council, the government says, hey, we're having this hearing. You can come to this hearing and tell us what you think. Another example of advocacy is meeting with elected officials to explain your issue and what you want them to do. And then another example is, for example, writing op-eds in newspapers to call attention to your issue. So these are kind of examples of traditional advocacy that's kind of working within the systems, the structures that are already in place. So the government kind of invites you in. They say, hey, we are having this meeting, you can come, or you can request a meeting, say, hey, I'd like to meet with you to talk about this issue. Activism is similar to advocacy in that it is also an activity that aims to influence decision makers to change. But activism typically works outside of a system. If you think about protests tend to fall in the category of activism. Civil disobedience, which is a term that we use here a lot, which is breaking the law to draw attention to the issue you want to change. So activism typically works outside of a system, whereas advocacy typically works inside the system. Advocacy tends to be a little bit nicer. You do things on their terms, with the decision makers' terms. You have a nice meeting. Activism tends to be more fervent, a little bit angrier, forceful. Activism differs from organizing in that it is not the act. Oh, sorry. I'm going to talk about organizing in a second, but just to point out that activism differs from organizing and that it is not the act of bringing other people into an advocacy movement. It is the act of showing up to events or doing actions that organizers have asked you to do. Now I'm going to talk about organizing in a minute. Activism and advocacy are complementary to each other. You often need both approaches. Sometimes this is called the inside versus outside. So advocacy from the inside, if you have contacts or networks with decision makers, you're advocating on the inside. Activism is from the outside. It's people who maybe don't have that access, but are pushing from the outside. So here's an example of activism. These are Palestine liberation activists protesting outside a conference of an organization that supports Israel and supports sending weapons to Israel. And so these people don't have contacts within that organization. And so they are I'm actually here. That's me right there. Are protesting outside this meeting. We weren't able to get inside. We weren't able to influence from the inside. So we're protesting from the outside. And this group is called the Interfaith Action for Palestine. So this is an example of activism. Now, organizing is the act of mobilizing more people to come together to take collective action on a specific issue now and to be prepared to take action on issues in the future. Organizing is a long-term process that requires building and sustaining relationships. It's like building a movement, getting more people organized around an issue. Organizing is often a part of advocacy, but not always. It can differ from advocacy or activism in that one person or even a few people can do advocacy without bringing in more people or groups to join their advocacy efforts. Organizers try to bring together more people to become advocates or activists. It's the act of bringing more people into a movement for change. So the example I have here is an announcement inviting, sorry, I have another typo there, an announcement inviting people to join a group of global development and humanitarian workers who are advocating for a ceasefire in Gaza. This is also a group I was a part of. So we were trying to bring in more people, train them up. We did education, teach them about what's going on. And then get more people to advocate to their organizations to take a stand and to advocate to their governments to take a stand. So this is an example of organizing more people who maybe care about the issue but don't know what to do, and organizers help organize them and mobilize them so that they know what to do and that we're doing it in a collective way so that it can make a difference. So this is organizing. Now, the fourth one I want to touch on is service provision. This is the act of providing what is sometimes called material resources, which is really just like tangible things like food, water, resources, housing, money, things that people can actually touch and experience, kind of like basic needs to people who need it. Service provision can go hand in hand with advocacy, but it's not a type of advocacy in and of itself. Some groups that do advocacy or organizing or activism, or all three, also provide direct service provision to fill in the gaps that leave people vulnerable or in need because of the policy or condition that advocates are trying to change. So examples include like food banks or homeless shelters or domestic violence shelters, which are addressing the immediate needs of hunger or homelessness or domestic violence, but are not changing these policies and systems that led to those conditions of homelessness and hunger. So this is an example of a group called Team Hassanat that's part of I know from my the global development in Palestine group that I just shared. So they created a small group that's just focused on raising money to give that goes directly to people in Gaza so that they can have food and water and sanitation kits. Now, Team Hassanat also does advocacy, but they also do service provision. So you can do both. But it is important to distinguish that service provision isn't in and of itself advocacy or activism. Usually. So let's stop and think about that. So we talked about these four things: advocacy, activism, organizing, service provision. So I want to ask you a question. Is a petition, so a petition that someone makes, so say a petition that says girls have the right to go to school, girls in Afghanistan should be allowed to go to school. Is that a form of activism, advocacy, or organizing? What do you think? Let's go to Aisha.
I think it's like a little bit of all three because you're organizing people to care about a cause, so that's organizing done. And then it's a bit of activism because there's like a law that, well, the system is saying that this thing is wrong or you can't do this thing, and then you're signing a petition to change the law. So technically, it could be activism. You're working a little bit outside, but advocacy, I can't tie it exactly very well into advocacy, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So, Man, what do you think?
I think it's kind of
advocacy in outside Afghanistan, like some people who are in UN and some other organization, they are wanted to help girls here in Afghanistan. So the advocacy for girls here, so they are going through the system. So for those who are here and they wanted to advocate for, they wanted to talk about their education and their rights. So this is activism and some kind of organization. I think so.
Yeah, thank you, Saman. Mokadisa, what do you think?
Yeah, in my opinion, I think it is advocacy because we had the example and that like girls should go to school is a belief and also a goal. It becomes advocacy, and the people that they are working for this goal, they are having some activism, and it's more like to advocacy.
Okay, thank you. And Abdul, let's go to you.
Okay, so I think it's like depending on the advocacy, because girls being allowed to go to school is most commonly related to advocacy because it focuses on changing policies, laws, or decision, and but also it can be like activism, because if you protest or resist public pressure, and also organizing. It also look like the organization and also the service provision. It's I think belongs to all of them, and it's the title that it's aim that we worked on it. It's belong
Okay,
to all of them.
yeah, thank you, Abdul. Okay, Ali, and then I'm going to share what I think.
Okay.
Go
Influence
ahead,
and
Ali.
decision making. Do you have my voice?
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah, okay. I think it is my influence and decision makers and mobilize support around for specific issues. While it can be part of activism or organizing on its own, it's the best categorized as advocacy, especially while it directed at the policymakers or institutions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so lots of talk about, well, it depends on what the petition is saying and who's it directed at, which is really, which is actually, which is a really good point. So some of it depends on what is the petition saying, who is it directed at. So many of you said it's kind of a combination of all three, and I think that that's a great response. And let me share here some examples. So if you look, I have a Venn diagram here of activism, advocacy, and organizing. So organizing, an example of organizing would be kind of recruiting friends to each get 5 people to sign the petition. So whoever is behind the petition, if they're actually getting more people to sign the petition, to come in, to join this movement, then it could be a part of organizing. Advocacy, let me go ahead and share this. So actually the act of signing the petition. So if you're an individual signing the petition, I mean, that could be activism, advocacy, maybe both. It kind of depends on what the petition is saying, who's it for. And I'm not really sure it matters that much. But then the act of sharing the petition in a meeting with an elected official is a great example of advocacy. So you get all these people to sign the petition and then you schedule a meeting but then what happens next, right? What are you going to do with that petition? So then you schedule a meeting, assuming you have access to the official, and you say, look, we have 10,000 people who signed this petition saying that this is what they want. You need to listen to them. So then that is definitely when it becomes advocacy. And then organizing is when you have a system in place where you're trying to get more people to sign a petition, and then they get more people to sign a petition. And then that's a way of organizing people to collectively take action. So the point of this was to show that there's nuance here. And these terms are often used interchangeably. And really what it comes down to is these different tactics and strategies that you're trying to take in order to influence change, because all of these are trying to influence change. However, it is important to remember that advocacy tends to be more working within the system, whereas activism is working with that outside of the system. Often there are overlaps and they are complementary and often need to work together. And you need to organize people usually, to be successful unless you have really good connections or a lot of power. And we'll talk about this in the future sessions. So some nuance and consideration. So activism is often a solution that people use when they don't have a seat at the table, as we say in English, with decision makers. So, or as we say here in the US. So when decision makers, or it's a tactic used when decision makers don't respond to traditional advocacy. You meet with them, you're nice, you're kind, but they don't care. And that's often when activism can be helpful. Activism, organizing, and advocacy and service provision can all be part of a broader strategy for change. Coordination and strategy is key, excuse me. Activism, advocacy, and organizing and service provision are, again, none of these are inherently good. They can be used for good and to cause harm. Your adversaries use these techniques too. And all of these can happen locally, nationally, internationally at different levels. So here's an example. This is another thing I was a part of. I talked about that group of development professionals. We could not get a meeting with USAID Administrator Samantha Power. We were trying to get her to call what was happening in Palestine, in Gaza, a genocide. We couldn't get a meeting, so we posted these leaflets around her office. And this is an example of activism. But you could also, yeah, I would say this is an example of activism. Now I want to share, I'm going to share links to this presentation so that you can, we're not quite done yet. But I want you to have these so that you can reference them. Okay. So I want to open it up for discussion. We have a few more minutes before we need to close. And so discussion question 1, which of the 3 type of advocacy, so self-advocacy, individual, or systems, are you most familiar with doing? 2, do you consider yourself an advocate, an activist, an organizer, or a combination of all 3? What do you aspire to be? And 3, what are some ways that service provision can be combined with what your advocacy, your activism, or your organizing to foster change? So I want you to spend some time on these 3 questions. We have a few minutes to discuss them here, but I also encourage you to, after the session, take some time and journal about them or think about them to reflect on what we discussed today. And I have another example here. This is an organization I used to be a part of called Parents Amplifying Voices in Education. It organizes parents, so it brings parents of children in Washington, D.C. together, teaches them how to be advocates, teaches them who they need to advocate to, where they need to go to advocate. And so this is a picture of them, again, advocating to US Congress about cuts to social safety nets that will have devastating effects on families. And this is also an example of advocacy that didn't work because Congress still cut those. And so this is when we will get into some of the challenges and how to protect ourselves against these rejections, which are what happens. So yeah, does anyone want to answer any of these discussion questions? Soman, go ahead.
For the first question, which of the 3 types of advocacy, self-individual or system, are you most familiar with doing? I am familiar with the individual advocacy because I was kind of wanted to advocate for other girls here in my community. So do you consider yourself as an advocate, an activism, or organizer? I think I would consider myself as an activist and organizer because I wanted to kind of raise awareness of early marriage and also the effect that will have in the family. So there was a kind of group, they were joined with me and they wanted to talk about this with families and also with some people who were kind of people who were respected in our community, and they can share their idea and they will accept, the family. So it was kind of activism and organizer. what are some ways that a service provision can be combined with advocacy, activism, and organizing uh, to foster change. I think there was a part of our community they wanted to help them, like there's a person who want to help these girls, like those who wanted to be forced to get married with someone they don't want it to. So there was a organization they helped them to start studying online, so they provide them money and also food and some kind of other like books and notebooks to help them to learn something and to build their future, not to be just kind of depressed or just leaving behind. So yeah, it's a kind of serving service organization.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of service provision. And I think in this day and age where advocacy is so hard and we often get rejected and it doesn't work or it doesn't work right now, we need to also be working or including some element of service provision so that the people we are trying to advocate for, whether that's people in our own community or people who are not. So if I think about Palestine, for example, um, who are not in my community, so that they are able to see some direct relief right now. But the problem is that it's not addressing the underlying. And so that's why it's almost like this combination is so important. However, that also means more work. It takes more time. Um, I want to let's go to, is it Xiaomi? So you haven't had a chance to speak, so I'll call on you first.
I'm sorry, it's me, Sarafrahi, and I don't know why my name changed suddenly.
That's okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the first question is, which of the three types of advocacy, self, individual, or systems, are you most familiar with doing? So I would say I'm more familiar with self-advocacy and system advocacy. So there are some problems in the systems that aren't being addressed. So you always have to raise your voice about that problem so that you can, change, at least add a change, or, there is a chance that you can improve that system. So I am always trying to do this because, there are some gaps and problems in some systems that should be addressed and solved. Sometimes it doesn't work, but it's good to, work on that and raise our voices. And do you consider yourself an advocate, an activist, an organizer, or a combination of all three? What do you aspire to be? Aspire to be, yeah. So I consider myself as a combination of all of them. My main goal is to raise my voice and never stay silent. And when there is a problem, and that is not, just, and it's injustice. So I want to raise my voice and speak up and tell people that it's not correct and it should be solved. There is this problem in the system. So I think I'm a combination of all these. And the third question is, what are some ways that service provision can be combined with advocacy, activism, and organizing to foster change? Well, I have an example for this. So when it was the first year that Taliban came to Afghanistan, and we created this program, this campaign with all my classmates that we provided notebooks, books, and some study material for people and other girls actually to, learn and keep learning. And we just brought them all these books and study materials to learn. So this was how we combined it with helping these girls to still educate themselves and keep learning.
Thank you. Yes, those are all great responses and great examples. We are at time, so I'm sorry, Mokadisa and Aisha, we don't have time for you all to respond, but I will stay on for a few minutes after if anybody wants to discuss. But I want to kind of wrap up so that we can, and we will continue more tomorrow. And these are questions, again, for you to reflect on and to think on as we go into the planning. So advocacy takes planning. And when I'm talking advocacy, activism, organizing, all of these take planning. And the next sessions, we're going to be talking about the steps in developing your advocacy plan. And these are the steps we're going to talk through, and these are all in the guidelines that I shared the link to you. So the type of analysis that you have to do of the issue and of the stakeholders, the people that you're trying to influence and the people who are affected by this issue. Determining your goals and then determining your strategy and your tactics, and we'll discuss the difference between those. And then we'll talk about implementation, evaluation, and then pivoting as needed, depending on what your results are. And then I mentioned advocacy survival skills. So practicing those advocacy survival skills, because as you all know, this is hard, it's tiring. And so there's some things that we need to be intentional about so that we don't burn out, as they say, and so that we're able to continue in this fight. So we don't really have time to get into these, but you're welcome to. So for the first question I was going to ask was, can you tell me more about the issues you're advocating for? But I actually feel like you answered that. So I have a good sense of all the different issues that you all are advocating for. And then if you want, before you leave, to put in the chat, if you have specific questions you have about advocacy, activism, organizing, all of these things, probably for most of this discussion, when I say advocacy, we're really talking about this broader movement for change. So it could also include activism and organizing, because as we've seen, there's a lot of overlaps there. So if you have any questions you want to make sure that are answered during these next sessions, please put them in the chat.